our next speaker, Ofir Katz, and he will talk about inorganic life and plants. Please.
Thank you and good morning, everybody. I'll be talking about the inorganic life of plants because in a conference like this we talk a lot about the organic, but the organic is a bit of a different story. And, well, we know it quite well that organic beings are made of organic components, and actually we see that 96% of plant biomass, for example, is the main component of hydrocarbons. An additional 2% are other elements that we usually find associated with organic molecules, such as nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. But there is another component, the part of what we usually call minerals or inorganic elements like potassium, calcium, magnesium, and silicon, which are a completely different story, but they are important. For instance, calcium is responsible to a large part of the signal transduction in plants. For example, magnesium is a crucial element in the sunlight reception for all the photosynthesis that was discussed just a few minutes ago. And there are other examples as well. So the question is, what can we do with those elements? And there are actually quite a lot of things. First of all, if we find plants that can take up quite large amounts of inorganic elements or minerals from polluted soils, we can use them. We know that there are plants that can take up aluminium. We can use them, for example, if the soil is contaminated by aluminium. We can find new plant natural products for medicine or other uses in a similar way to the way we find organic plant products. We can use them for crop enhancement. Some of these elements are crucial for certain processes such as photosynthesis, and we know that if we add them to crops, they grow better and have a larger yields. It's also important in the case of extreme environments, such as the environment we are talking about here, because some of these elements are rather crucial for the adaptation of plants to these environments, and eventually we can use this also in more ecological manners to see how vegetation responds to changes if environmental changes affect the ability of plants to take up these elements or to use them, and if it affects their adaptation to these changes. And in this region we have several nice examples. It was very nice to take a picture with 3 examples in them. First, the tamarisk, very common tree in our region. It accumulates large amounts of gypsum. It basically needs to deal with the problem of soils here having too much sulfate in them. They take up the sulfate, they deposit them as gypsum minerals, and I'm talking about something that can get to more than 10% of wood dry weight being actually gypsum. Another example is the Atriplex, one of the more common plants. Some of these species, including an invasive species from Australia, are annuals that can grow over 1 meter per year. These plants accumulate large amounts of sodium chloride as table salt, basically. They accumulate it mostly in their leaves, which is also a defense mechanism because animals would not like to consume large amounts of salt. It's not healthy, and it's also quite irritating for some of them. And the last example, the one I will focus about in a few minutes I have, is the arundo, which accumulates large amounts of silicon oxide, or opal A in more technical terms, which to layman's terms translates as basically microscopic glass. And this is how these things tend to look when you look at them under the microscope. Has of various uses. They have various functions in plants. a defense against extreme temperatures, both very high and below freezing. Water deficiency, this is basically a layer above the epidermis. You can't lose too much water through this layer. It's a physical barrier. Nutrient deficiencies, salinity, acidity, and metal toxicity are quite some of the examples. For example, we have a nice case in Israel. Actually, I think the plant is still available, still grows in the Tel Aviv University Botanical Garden. They had a soil that was polluted by aluminium. They needed something to get rid of the aluminium. Luckily for us, silicon and aluminium love each other, so they planted a plant that took silicon with aluminium, accumulated large amounts of aluminium. They could clean the soil like this. And also, referring to biotic stresses, just think of an ant trying to eat something like this. It can't be good, and we know that in some cases, microscopic silicon particles cause cancer in mice, especially in the areas related to their mouths, because of, well, silicosis, basically. And the question is, the main question, I think, is the variation of plant silicon contents in various plants. And we know that there are some of them that are related to function. Some plants will accumulate more silicon if they are exposed to a pathogen or an herbivore or stress, for example. Things that are related to the environment, plants will take more silicon if they have more water, but if they don't have enough water, they may use it to block water loss. Evapotranspiration obviously is very important. It's the way that plants can take up silicon from the soil with water. And herbivory, there are quite a lot of experiments showing that when plants, especially grasses, are exposed to herbivores, they tend to accumulate more silicon as a defense. There's also a lot of information about the phylogeny and possibly the associated physiology. A group in Japan has identified so far 4 silicon transporters in plants. We know the genes that code them. We can now knock out silicon transporters in plants, for example. And we know the distribution of silicon in general and of these transporters. And if we take a small look at the phylogenetic tree of angiosperms, the flowering plants, we can see that we can find the families in which we know there are silicon accumulating plants shown in green in various plant parts of this tree. Also, the families with no known silicon accumulators. And what I think is most striking is the white part, the families for which we have no information. So there's quite a long way to go there. The question I want to focus about today is the question of evolution, because it's probably the one that we understand the least. I'll start with an example of the problem of diversity relating to this issue. It's always a bit disappointing to see your PhD summed to one slide, but I guess you get there at a certain point. I remember a conference when I needed to present my whole PhD and had only 12 minutes. Now I have one slide. I took quite an interesting challenge because we know that silicon is mostly common in grasses. And almost everything we know about it in terms of physiology, in terms of ecology, functions, come from grasses. But there are many other families that also accumulate silicon in smaller contents, such as the Asteraceae, the daisy family. And the question was, does silicon have similar roles or plays roles to a similar extent? And the hypothesis was, well, less silicon, probably less functional. And then you have a nice challenge of proving that something doesn't exist. And there is a way of doing it. And what we did was basically put 4 hypotheses that are that we get them from general ecological theories, referring to the assumption if silicon has a defensive role, we would expect it to behave this way or the other. In all cases, we know we did already have evidence from grasses that those patterns exist. And in all 4 cases, I will not go over them because of the time. In all cases, we know that they exist in grasses. We saw them in grasses. We didn't find them in the Asteraceae. So 4 times not showing a role, I think, is should be quite convincing, or at least making the point. And then I moved to look at the phylogeny and evolutionary history, knowing that there is a relation between concentrations, contents, and the roles themselves. And what I did here was taking the emergence dates of all known angiosperm orders, in this case, simply because we didn't have the resolution we needed to do it in the family level in terms of the dating, and see when we find the emergence of silicon-containing orders in green, which means orders in which we know there are some silicon-containing families, and orders in which we know of no silicon accumulators, and put them on a map. And this is only just one example of several graphs we have. The main point here is that we find this trend of increased emergence of orders that accumulate silicon at a very short period of time, around the transition from the early to the late Cretaceous, around 100 million years ago. But these are emergence dates. When you talk about success, when you talk about the ecology, we don't only need the plant to exist, we need the plant or the trait to actually be significant ecologically, to be rather diverse, rather active ecologically, let's put it in these terms, which means that molecular phylogenies are probably not what we need. We need also the fossil record, because if the gene exists, it means it exists. It refers to the emergence. But what we want is a lot of fossils, diverse families with the trait, which suggests that the trait actually kicks in. So the rise to ecological success is usually later than the phylogenetic, the molecular signal. So if we see this slope somewhere around 100 million years ago, then the success is probably a bit later, and all the data we found pointed to around 85 million years ago. So the question is, what happened, or what may be explanatory to 85 million years ago? And the question was actually very well in front of us all the time. We just didn't see it I didn't see it for a while. These two groups of dinosaurs, the hadrosaurs and the ceratopsians, both of them are adapted to abrasive food. Both of them can cope well with silicon-containing food. They have two main adaptations. The first adaptation is their ability to move their jaws laterally. The second one you can see here, no longer those isolated sharp teeth that we usually find in all reptiles, but cheek teeth batteries. So basically we see here some sort of an analog of the cow's teeth. These two groups of dinosaurs are commonly known as the cows of the Cretaceous. Actually, according to some biomechanical studies, they're even more efficient in dealing with abrasive food compared to modern cows and grazers. So we have someone that can eat this. So the first thought was obviously a direct plant herbivore coevolution. Plants are adapted to those cows, and those cows are adapted to the abrasiveness of this plant containing the silicon-containing plants. But there's also another possibility of indirect coevolution. First of all, we know that these animals could probably take in more silicon because they can cope with more siliceous foods. We know those plants usually have shorter life cycles. We're talking about the early angiosperms. Many of those species are still annual, and angiosperms in general have relatively short life cycles, which means that silicon is recycled faster in those systems. So silicon is more available in the soil. Now, if there are plants that can take up this silicon and utilize it and benefit it more than others, then those plants should have the evolutionary benefit. I published it in this paper in 2015, and I thought to myself, you know, the nice thing about this hypothesis, no one will ever prove it correct or disprove it. In the 2 years after that, there were two papers showing that actually one of them actually showing a hadrosaur feeding on grasses, on silicon-rich grasses. So we know that there is a connection. We know that well, it's not a proof, obviously, but it would show that the case is valid, which was rather nice to see that happen. But the story doesn't end here, because we also know there are several connections between silicon and carbon that may be important for the evolution of silicon accumulation in plants. First of all, in recent years, we have more and more evidence that silicon can play a partial substitute for carbon. It's also energetically cheaper. Instead of using lignin, for example, to have an erect posture, you can use silicon. You basically make your skeleton out of glass instead of lignin, which suggests that maybe there is a substitutional role of silicon as a substitute for carbon. This idea was even more interesting, because if we look and we go a little to a more recent times, let's say around 30 million years ago, we see a drop in atmospheric CO2 concentrations, and shortly after that, grass-dominated ecosystems start to dominate the world, which suggests that maybe this was because grasses, as the greatest silicon accumulators, could use silicon as a partial substitute for carbon when carbon availability dropped. And this actually brings quite an interesting idea, I think, because it shows that at a certain point in time, 30 million years ago, plants faced a problem that is quite similar to the problem we have as humans today. We live and thrive, but depend very much on carbon. Now, when carbon becomes less abundant, in the past because of atmospheric changes, today because, well, we use most of our fossil fuels today, when carbon becomes less abundant, it becomes more costly in terms of money or ATP. So plants probably solved it in two ways. First of all, they developed what we call C4 photosynthesis, which is more carbon efficient, but grasses may have been able to use silicon as a substitute or partial substitute for carbon and replace their carbon with something else. And we are actually doing something that is a bit similar today. We use photovoltaic cells, which are composed in part of silicon, to produce our energy instead of using carbon fuels to produce our energy. Which shows that probably plants and I guess also animals, although I don't do a lot of work with animals, have coped with various problems that we may be facing today, and we probably face some of them. They have been facing them for millions of years. They have evolved solutions. So we can learn from them. This is the lesson from nature we can take from the case of inorganic plant components, that eventually we may learn about how plants and animals evolved solutions and use those solutions ourselves. We heard 2 days ago a nice talk about biomimicry. I think we can call that maybe ecomimicry, but I think the concept is basically the same. Thank you.
So we can say, no question? So we can say, we have the coffee break for questions.